Daniel Harris was used to the quiet solitude of long drives down deserted highways, the flicker of fluorescent lights at a gas station his only reminder of civilization in the stillness of night. It was well past midnight when he pulled his sleek black sedan into an open fuel pump at a station perched on the edge of a quiet highway. The station's dim lights cast long, wavering shadows across the pavement, and the occasional hum of a passing car blended with the soft whoosh of the wind. Daniel, a composed black man in his late 20s, stepped out of his car and stretched his tired shoulders. The long stretches of open road had given him time to think, to decompress from the weight of his demanding job, and tonight he wasn't in any hurry. He moved with a calm, deliberate pace as he grabbed the fuel nozzle and began filling his tank. For Daniel, nights like these were routine. He had grown accustomed to the solitude and the time it offered him to gather his thoughts after grueling shifts at the auto repair shop where he worked. However, as he focused on the steady stream of fuel, something unusual caught his eye. In the rear windshield of his car, amidst the darkness, the reflection of flashing red and blue lights appeared. He glanced up and noticed a police cruiser slowly pulling into the lot, its sirens silent yet unmistakable in their urgency. A few yards away, the cruiser rolled to a stop. At first, Daniel did not react. After all, it was not uncommon for patrol cars to make rounds at gas stations, checking for drunk drivers or surveying for any suspicious activity. Yet, as his eyes met the vehicle's window, he saw something that made his heart quicken. Through the glass, he observed the silhouette of an officer, waiting, watching. The cruiser's door swung open and a young cop stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. His hand hovered near his baton as if he expected trouble. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. He already sensed how this encounter might unfold. "Evening," said the officer in a voice sharp and edged with authority. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Daniel, resting one elbow on the roof of his car as he continued fueling, responded in a calm but firm tone. "I'm just filling my tank." The officer squinted at him, as if dissatisfied with that answer, and then said, "This your vehicle?" Daniel glanced briefly at his car and then back at the cop. "It is," he confirmed, his voice steady. The officer's stance shifted slightly. He stepped closer, his legs widening and his shoulders squaring. Daniel noted every twitch of the officer's fingers and every fleeting glance toward the empty lot, as if the cop were checking for witnesses. There was no obvious reason for this confrontation. No law had been broken, and nothing appeared suspicious about a man refueling at a gas station. Yet Daniel sensed that the officer was driven by something other than genuine concern. Taking a measured breath, Daniel asked carefully, "Is there a reason for this request?" The officer's jaw tensed and he replied in a statement, not a question, "You're acting suspicious." Daniel tilted his head, holding the officer's gaze steadily. "Suspicious? How? I'm out here late, dressed in a tailored navy suit with polished shoes. Does that not fit the area?" The cop gestured dismissively at Daniel's attire. Daniel let out a quiet laugh. "So what exactly would fit then?" The officer offered no answer, merely shifting his weight and stepping closer. "Hand over your ID," he ordered. Daniel remained unmoved. "Am I being detained?" he asked. That question made the officer's eyes flash momentarily, and a muscle in his cheek twitched, as if he were unaccustomed to being challenged. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again," the officer said, his fingers grazing the handle of his baton. For a few long moments neither man spoke. The gas pump clicked softly, signaling that Daniel's tank was now full, yet neither moved to end the standoff. Other customers at the station lingered at a distance. A man adjusting his side mirror pretended not to notice, and a woman refilling her soda at the station's entrance slowed her steps, watching carefully before quickly slipping inside. Daniel had encountered tense situations like this before, too many times to count. He knew that if handled the wrong way, such moments could spiral dangerously out of control, but tonight something in the air felt different. The officer was just getting started. The atmosphere between them grew heavier. Daniel could see it in the officer's stance. His feet planted wider, his chin slightly raised as if he were waiting for an excuse. Daniel wasn't about to provide one. "I asked you a question," the officer said in a measured tone. "Am I being detained?" Daniel repeated, his voice unwavering. The officer took another step forward, now close enough for Daniel to see a sharp glint in his eyes. "You're being investigated," the officer scoffed. For loitering, acting suspicious. Daniel exhaled slowly. He could have argued or called out the absurdity of it all, but he knew too well how quickly things escalated when an officer's ego was bruised. Instead, he kept his hands relaxed at his sides and replied steadily, "I just filled my tank, that isn't loitering." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You got drugs in the car?" he asked. Daniel blinked in disbelief. The cop's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "What's in the trunk?" the officer demanded. Daniel shook his head. "You have no probable cause to search my car." At that moment, Daniel felt the weight of the officer's suspicion like a tightening noose. The officer took a sharp breath. His fingers curled around the baton at his hip. For a split second, Daniel saw something dangerous in the officer's expression. Then it hit him. This officer didn't just want to assert control. He wanted a reaction, a flinch, a stammer, a moment of fear to justify whatever he had already planned. Daniel had seen it before. The false charges, the resisting arrest accusations, the injuries that later became self-inflicted in reports. He knew the game and he knew how it ended. But before he could decide what to say next, the officer's voice sliced through the tense air like a sharpened blade. "Step away from the vehicle." Daniel didn't move. The officer's jaw clenched as his fingers flexed around the handle of his baton before he finally pulled it from his belt. They said, "Step away from the vehicle." Daniel interrupted calmly. "I heard you." His voice was unwavering, and the silence that followed was thick with warning. At the far end of the lot, a man adjusting his mirror froze, watching the scene intently. Inside the gas station, a woman near the window gripped her phone in both hands, and even the older attendant behind the counter shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Daniel and the officer. Yet no one stepped in. No one ever did. The officer's grip on the baton tightened, as if he were waiting for the slightest twitch, the smallest movement, any excuse to escalate the situation. Daniel could feel that tension building between them, as if a storm were imminent. Then, without warning, headlights flooded the station. A sudden burst of bright light cut through the darkness, piercing the tension like a knife. The flood of headlights washed over the gas station, stretching long shadows across the pavement. The officer flinched. His grip on the baton tightened even more, but Daniel did not turn. He didn't need to. He could already sense the shift in the air. Engines rumbled as dark SUVs rolled to a slow, deliberate stop near the gas pump. Their tinted windows were blacked out, their rims gleaming in the light. These were no ordinary vehicles. For the first time since the encounter had begun, Daniel saw uncertainty flicker across the officer's face. Inside the gas station, the woman by the window pressed her phone tighter in her hands, her eyes darting between Daniel, the SUVs, and the man at the far end of the lot, who had been pretending not to see. Now he turned fully in his seat, watching intently. Even the attendant behind the counter stood a little straighter, his hands hovering near the register, as if he were bracing himself for what was coming next. The officer's gaze snapped back to Daniel, suspicion darkening his expression. "Who the hell is that?" he demanded, though Daniel did not answer. In near unison, the SUV doors swung open. The unmistakable click of polished dress shoes on pavement was heard as several sharply dressed, clean-cut men stepped out. They moved with quiet precision, their demeanor radiating authority. It wasn't just the suits. They carried themselves with straight backs, unwavering focus, and discreet earpieces. For the first time, the officer's confidence wavered. His entire posture shifted, his authority wobbling just slightly. He wasn't stupid. He recognized the controlled movements, the type of people who entered a situation with purpose rather than stumbling into it. His eyes flickered between these men and Daniel as he tried to piece together the sudden change. Then, one of the men, a tall figure with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward. Without even glancing at the cop, he addressed Daniel directly. "Sir, are you all right?" His voice was cool and professional. He spoke directly to Daniel, completely ignoring the officer. The shift was immediate. The officer stiffened his grip on the baton and for the first time loosened his hold ever so slightly. He took a half step back and cleared his throat. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The agent did not respond. Instead, two more men from the SUVs took position near Daniel's car, their eyes scanning the scene with the precision of trained professionals. The officer swallowed hard as Daniel maintained his calm gaze. "I was just explaining my rights to him," Daniel said simply. His words landed like a hammer for the first time, and the officer hesitated. The baton at his side now felt like dead weight in his grip. The authority he had wielded moments before was slipping away. Yet, the officer wasn't ready to back down, not until he fully understood who he was dealing with. His fingers twitched near the baton, but he did not lift it. Not now, not with 3 well-dressed men standing between him and Daniel. His breathing had grown shallow, his confidence clearly diminished. One of the agents then took a slow step forward, his hands relaxed at his sides. Despite his calm appearance, his presence radiated an unspoken authority, the kind that didn't need raised voices or empty threats. The officer squared his shoulders. "Someone's going to tell me what's going on here," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier bite. Finally, the first agent turned to him, leveling a calm, assessing look. "And you are the cop, correct?" the agent stated. "Officer Grant, I believe?" The officer, now identified as Grant LLPD, nodded slightly, as if confirming a box on an unspoken checklist. "Officer Grant, do you have a reason for detaining Mr. Harris the way you did?" the agent asked, his tone measured and precise. "Mr. Harris," the officer repeated, "was acting suspiciously." The agent's head tilted slightly, unimpressed. "How so?" Grant's mouth opened, then closed. He had plenty of answers before, but now, under the agent's steady gaze, none of them felt convincing. He shifted uncomfortably. "I asked for ID," he finally said. He refused. The agent's expression remained unchanged. "Is that a crime?" Silence fell for a moment. One of the other agents produced a phone and tapped its screen. Grant noticed the movement and instinctively stepped back. "What is this? Who are you people?" he demanded. The first agent sighed as though he were tired of this conversation. "Secret Service," he replied curtly. Just 2 words, and that was all it took. At that moment, Officer Grant's entire face shifted from smug confidence to alarm. His eyes darted to Daniel, really looking at him for the first time. The expensive suit, the calm confidence, the undeniable aura of control. It became clear that these men with power weren't here solely for the officer. They were here because of Daniel. The officer swallowed thickly, his throat working around an apology that refused to form. One of the agents pulled something from his pocket, a badge. He held it up briefly so that Officer Grant could see. "Mr. Harris is a high-ranking government official," the agent stated in a clipped professional tone. "You just detained him without cause." Grant's apple bobbed as he could feel sweat beading at the base of his neck. I wasn't detaining him," Grant stammered, exhaling sharply. "I was just—" Before he could continue, the agent raised a brow. "Just what, Officer Grant?" Grant couldn't answer because there was no answer. The gas station fell completely silent. No one pretended not to watch any longer. The man in the car, the woman by the window, even the cashier behind the counter, all saw the shift in power in an instant. Officer Grant took a shaky step back. His baton, once a symbol of authority and threat, now felt utterly useless at his side. Daniel watched him with an unreadable expression before finally speaking. "I was just about to explain my rights to him," Daniel said quietly. It wasn't loud or angry, but its weight was undeniable. For once, Daniel wasn't the one forced into a defensive stance. The officer was, and he knew it. Officer Grant's breathing grew uneven, and his posture was no longer rigid with authority but stiff with uncertainty. The weight of his mistake settled over him like a suffocating blanket. All around the gas station, only the distant hum of passing traffic broke the silence. No one spoke, no one moved. Everyone waited for something, anything, that even Officer Grant wasn't sure would come. Then the first agent, whose salt and pepper hair was now paired with an unreadable expression, tilted his head slightly and said, "Mr. Harris, do you want to press charges?" The word struck Officer Grant like a hammer. His stomach twisted. "Charges?" His voice cracked slightly, and he hated himself for even uttering the word. Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply looked at him, really looked, taking in the man who had been so quick to flex his authority, who had demanded submission and expected it without question. Now here he stood exposed, and Daniel knew that uttering just one word could end him. The officer swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides, and his badge suddenly felt heavier than ever. "I didn't know who you were," Officer Grant stammered weakly, his voice an unconvincing admission. Daniel let out a quiet sigh and shook his head slightly. "That's the problem," Daniel said. "It shouldn't matter who I am." Officer Grant's face burned with shame. Another agent stepped forward and said flatly, "We have this entire interaction recorded. Dash cams, witnesses, store cameras, everything." Officer Grant's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked toward the gas station. The woman by the window was still watching him. The man in the car hadn't looked away. They had seen everything. He knew how this would play out if it went public. Suspension, investigations, maybe even worse. The cold sweat on the back of his neck seemed to grow even colder. One of the agents checked his watch. "Sir," the agent said. "Please, Officer Grant," Daniel exhaled, rubbing his jaw for a moment before looking back at the officer. "You don't get to do this," Daniel said calmly but firmly. "Not to me, not to anyone." Officer Grant's eyes faltered as Daniel continued. Daniel didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see the officer lose his job to feel justified. The lesson had already been delivered. Slowly, he stepped toward his car and nodded at the agents. "We're done here." The agents did not argue. They moved with him smoothly and methodically, as though it were routine. Officer Grant could do nothing but watch as Daniel opened his car door, slid inside, and pulled away. There were no sirens, no arrests, no last-minute power grabs. Just a man leaving a gas station and an officer left standing, in the wake of his own failure. Officer Grant stood frozen, watching Daniel's taillights disappear into the night. The SUVs lingered for a moment longer, as if giving him one last chance to grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. Then, one by one, they pulled out of the gas station, gliding back onto the road with an eerie smoothness. And just like that, it was over. His pulse still hammered against his ribs, his hands remained clammy despite the cool night air, and his entire body felt rigid, locked in place by the weight of what he had done, or perhaps what he had nearly done. The gas station remained silent. The woman by the window turned away and finally stepped back into the store. The man in the car shook his head slightly before driving off. The cashier behind the counter lingered for a few more seconds before disappearing into the aisles. No words were exchanged. No one needed to speak, because everyone knew that Officer Grant had been exposed. Not by force, not by violence, but by something far worse. Accountability. He had pushed, expecting submission. He had threatened, expecting obedience. And for once, his power had been stripped away. The realization sat heavily in his chest. The way Daniel had handled himself was unwavering. The way those agents had not even regarded Officer Grant as a threat proved that his authority meant nothing once true power stepped in. Had Officer Grant been willing to follow through? If those SUVs hadn't arrived, would he have slammed Daniel against the hood of his own car? Would he have forced him into cuffs, justifying it with some flimsy pretext about resisting arrest? The thought made his stomach twist in uncertainty. Maybe, maybe not. But deep down he knew he had wanted to. That truth was the hardest pill to swallow. A sharp gust of wind rattled the loose sign above the gas pumps, snapping him from his thoughts. He took a step back, glancing around as if waking from a nightmare. But it was no dream. It was a reckoning he would not forget. Turning toward his cruiser, he reached for the door handle, yet something stopped him. His reflection in the window, for the first time in a long while, showed him a man he did not like. There are moments that shift the balance and rip away the false sense of control. Some people believe they have it all, but tonight was one of those moments. For too long, men like Daniel Harris had to navigate these encounters carefully, balancing between calm and survival. But why should the outcome of a routine stop depend on status? Why should it matter whether someone has the right connections or protection? What happens to the men and women who do not have black SUVs pulling up to save them? What happens to those who are unseen? It is all too easy to ignore a problem when it doesn't touch you. But eventually, silence becomes complicity. The only way true change happens is when those in power are forced to confront their own reflection. Because once you see yourself for what you really are, you cannot unsee it. If this story has made you think, that's good, but thinking isn't enough. Action matters, and awareness matters. Too many people do not get the chance to walk away like Daniel did. Too many do not have the privilege of proving their humanity after being treated as a threat. If you believe in justice, in fairness, in a world where who you are matters more than how you look, then make sure to stay informed. Speak up and hold people accountable, because the next time a moment like this happens, who will be watching? Who will be standing on the right side of power? One of the agents then took a slow step forward, his hands relaxed at his sides. Despite his calm appearance, his presence radiated an unspoken authority, the kind that didn't need raised voices or empty threats. The officer squared his shoulders. "Someone's going to tell me what's going on here," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier bite. Finally, the first agent turned to him, leveling a calm, assessing look. "And you are the cop, correct?" the agent stated. "Officer Grant, I believe." The officer, now identified as Grant LLPD, nodded slightly, as if confirming a box on an unspoken checklist. "Officer Grant, do you have a reason for detaining Mr. Harris the way you did?" the agent asked, his tone measured and precise. "Mr. Harris," the officer repeated, "was acting suspiciously." The agent's head tilted slightly, unimpressed. "How so?" Grant's mouth opened, then closed. He had plenty of answers before, but now under the agent's steady gaze, none of them felt convincing. He shifted uncomfortably. "I asked for ID," he finally said. "He refused." The agent's expression remained unchanged. "Is that a crime?" Silence fell for a moment. One of the other agents produced a phone and tapped its screen. Grant noticed the movement and instinctively stepped back. "What is this? Who are you people?" he demanded. The first agent sighed as though he were tired of this conversation. "Secret Service," he replied curtly. Just 2 words, and that was all it took. At that moment, Officer Grant's entire face shifted from smug confidence to alarm. His eyes darted to Daniel, really looking at him for the first time. The expensive suit, the calm confidence, the undeniable aura of control. It became clear that these men with power weren't here solely for the officer. They were here because of Daniel. The officer swallowed thickly, his throat working around an apology that refused to form. One of the agents pulled something from his pocket. A badge. He held it up briefly so that Officer Grant could see. "Mr. Harris is a high-ranking government official," the agent stated in a clipped professional tone. "You just detained him without cause." Grant's apple bobbed as he could feel sweat beading at the base of his neck. I wasn't detaining him," Grant stammered, exhaling sharply. "I was just..." Before he could continue, the agent raised a brow. "Just what, Officer Grant?" Grant couldn't answer because there was no answer. The gas station fell completely silent. No one pretended not to watch any longer. The man in the car, the woman by the window, even the cashier behind the counter, all saw the shift in power in an instant. Officer Grant took a shaky step back. His baton, once a symbol of authority and threat, now felt utterly useless at his side. Daniel watched him with an unreadable expression before finally speaking. "I was just about to explain my rights to him," Daniel said quietly. It wasn't loud or angry, but its weight was undeniable. For once, Daniel wasn't the one forced into a defensive stance, the officer was. And he knew it. Officer Grant's breathing grew uneven, and his posture was no longer rigid with authority but stiff with uncertainty. The weight of his mistake settled over him like a suffocating blanket. All around the gas station, only the distant hum of passing traffic broke the silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone waited for something, anything, that even Officer Grant wasn't sure would come. Then, the first agent, whose salt and pepper hair was now paired with an unreadable expression, tilted his head slightly and said, "Mr. Harris, do you want to press charges?" The words struck Officer Grant like a hammer, his stomach twisted. "Charges?" His voice cracked slightly, and he hated himself for even uttering the words. Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply looked at him, really looked, taking in the man who had been so quick to flex his authority, who had demanded submission and expected it without question. Now here he stood, exposed, and Daniel knew that uttering just one word could end him. The officer swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides, and his badge suddenly felt heavier than ever. I didn't know who you were," Officer Grant stammered weakly, his voice an unconvincing admission. Daniel let out a quiet sigh and shook his head slightly. "That's the problem," Daniel said. "It shouldn't matter who I am." Officer Grant's face burned with shame. Another agent stepped forward and said flatly, "We have this entire interaction recorded. Dashcams, witnesses, store cameras, everything. Officer Grant's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked toward the gas station. The woman by the window was still watching him. The man in the car hadn't looked away. They had seen everything. He knew how this would play out if it went public. Suspension, investigations, maybe even worse. The cold sweat on the back of his neck seemed to grow even colder. One of the agents checked his watch. "Sir," the agent said. "Please, Officer Grant." Daniel exhaled, rubbing his jaw for a moment before looking back at the officer. "You don't get to do this," Daniel said calmly but firmly. "Not to me. Not to anyone." Officer Grant's eyes faltered as Daniel continued. Daniel didn't need revenge. He didn't need to see the officer lose his job to feel justified. The lesson had already been delivered. Slowly he stepped toward his car and nodded at the agents. "We're done here." The agents did not argue. They moved with him smoothly and methodically, as though it were routine. Officer Grant could do nothing but watch as Daniel opened his car door, slid inside and pulled away. There were no sirens, no arrests, no last-minute power grabs. Just a man leaving a gas station and an officer left standing in the wake of his own failure. Officer Grant stood frozen, watching Daniel's taillights disappear into the night. The SUVs lingered for a moment longer, as if giving him one last chance to grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. Then, one by one, they pulled out of the gas station, gliding back onto the road with an eerie smoothness, and just like that, it was over. His pulse still hammered against his ribs. His hands remained clammy despite the cool night air, and his entire body felt rigid, locked in place by the weight of what he had done, or perhaps what he had nearly done. The gas station remained silent. The woman by the window turned away and finally stepped back into the store. The man in the car shook his head slightly before driving off. The cashier behind the counter lingered for a few more seconds before disappearing into the aisles. No words were exchanged. No one needed to speak, because everyone knew that Officer Grant had been exposed, not by force, not by violence, but by something far worse. Accountability. He had pushed, expecting submission. He had threatened, expecting obedience. And for once, his power had been stripped away. The realization sat heavily in his chest. The way Daniel had handled himself was unwavering. The way those agents had not even regarded Officer Grant as a threat proved that his authority meant nothing once true power stepped in.